Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about the delay and thanks for your patience. Today, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Rahul Deogharia. He's a recent PhD graduate from the Indian Institute of Technology, Bhubaneswar, where he worked under the supervision of Dr. Saurav Sen in the School of Earth, Ocean, and Climate Sciences. His doctoral research was focused on doing Lagrangian coherent structure analysis from ocean model outputs and other in situ data. I think we will hear about some of it in his talk today. Before doing his PhD, he did his master's degree in physics from IIT Roorkee and also has some professional experience in working in geoscience research and development as a petrophysicist at Shell. Okay. Pleasure to have you today and please. Thank you.
So, thanks for the kind introduction. This talk is going to be about Lagrangian coherent structures and what happens to transport and mixing when these structures tend to get attached to the coastlines. So, here's an outline of the talk. I'll quickly, in the first couple of slides, try to motivate the idea of Lagrangian coherent structures, and then we'll dive into the actual work. In between, what we'll do is we'll digress a bit to see a different problem where we used surface current data from what is known as high frequency radar, and there are always these problems of gaps in the high frequency radar fields. So the second part will the digression that we'll make will actually look into a way to fill those gaps. So to motivate why the LCS framework is needed, the problem of transport and mixing is inherently Lagrangian in nature. So in principle, what we can do is we can have a large number of trajectories either simulated or observed and can get a fair idea about the flow. But in practice, what happens is making sense out of those large number of Lagrangian trajectories is very difficult. So what people did was similar problem is generally faced when solving nonlinear dynamical systems. So what people do over there is whenever there are systems and this nonlinear dynamical or dynamical systems can be assumed to be flow in the phase space, right? So there is this relation with fluid flows. Now, what people do is in dynamical systems is whenever they are unable to integrate a system analytically, they look into the geometry of the trajectories in the phase space, and that tells us a lot about the system itself. So to give you a simple example, which is often cited in this regard, is the example of the simple pendulum. So this figure shows you the phase portrait of the simple pendulum. So what you will see here is we have these closed trajectories which correspond to the periodic motion of the pendulum. And then we have these open lines which kind of corresponds to the unbounded spinning of the pendulum all the way through. In between these two motions, we have these very special red lines called the separatrices, which actually separate out these two flow regimes. Also, we have some special points in this phase portrait here and here. Okay, these are called the fixed points of the system. Okay, if you leave the system over there, it won't move. So this point over here is a stable fixed point, whereas this one is an unstable fixed point. Okay, because and a property of an unstable fixed point is you will see there are lines that are asymptotically coming towards it, and then there are lines which are going away from the unstable fixed point or a saddle point. So this particular part will become important for our talk later on. Now people used this idea from dynamical systems theory, applied it to fluids to understand transport and mixing. So there was this field that was invented by RF back in 1987, where what he did was applied these ideas to simple problems which had some special properties, like They were steady, time periodic, and known for asymptotically very long times. And they were able to find out those particular lines for the fluid. But when people try to apply those ideas to real flows, like the ones in geophysical fluids, we always have this challenge that the flow field is known for a finite time. Also, it's highly unsteady. And then the time dependence is not known a priori. So to counter these problems, the framework of LCS was developed so that it can address these challenges. Now, those special lines that we saw in the phase portrait of the simple pendulum are what are known as the LCSs in this context. And they have certain properties which are relevant for this talk. The first property is that those surfaces are composed of actual fluid trajectories, and hence they are material surfaces. Now, we have also seen that in the phase portrait, no two trajectories intersected, because then the solutions become non-unique. So, as a consequence of that, every material surface is a barrier to advective transport. So, there will be no advective transport through a LCS. And as a consequence of that part, the LCSs tend to separate dynamically very distinct regimes of flow. As an additional property, this property of frame invariance or objectivity was built into the framework so that the results of the framework are experimentally verifiable from different reference frames. So this figure that you see on the right is what a typical, what we call hyperbolic Lagrangian coherent structure looks like, and it has a lot of similarity with the phase portrait of the pendulum that we saw. So you see here we had an unstable or saddle type of point. We have a saddle type of a point here, and then we have these two lines emanating from the blue one, which we called an attracting LCS, because all the fluid trajectories near it will tend to be attracted towards it, whereas in the transverse direction they are repelled. So that's why in the transverse direction we have the repelling LCS. So taken together, this structure is known as a hyperbolic Lagrangian coherent structure. Now we come to our own work. Here, in literature, it was suggested that those lines that we saw, the Lagrangian coherent structures, they sometimes tend to get attached to the coastline. And by attached, I mean the attachment point may move with time. It's not fixed. Okay. So this kind of a configuration was suggested in literature by Hoon in 2012, and then it was reviewed in 2024 by Peng. So we wanted to see what sort of an impact these coastally attached Lagrangian coherent structures would have on coastal transport and mixing. So then we thought of what could be the very simple configurations that could exist in the coastal regions. So we thought we could think of two very simple configurations. We call the first configuration the type 1 configuration, where what happens is either an attracting or a repelling LCS is attached to the coastline at a point. Then we thought this structure might loop back and connect again to the coastline, and that is what the type 2 is. If it connects again, for forming what looks like a heterophilic connection, but actually it's not a heterophilic connection, because I'll come into why it is not so the case. But we can think of this to be a near heterophilic connection. Now, this is what we thought would exist in the coastal regions, and then we actually started looking into the data. We saw this. So what you see here on the leftmost, we have chlorophyll data. So chlorophyll in ocean is a proxy for biological productivity. Okay, so how the more the phytoplankton activity there is, the more chlorophyll that you will see. In the middle panel, you see sea surface temperature, and on the rightmost, you have a true color image from the Sentinel satellite. What you see here is on this day that I'm showing you the data for, both the kinds of coastally attached Lagrangian coherent structures were found to exist, both the type 1 and type 2. So in white I have shown the type 1 and in green I have shown the type 2. So what you will see is this white LCS is attached to the coastline at one single point here. And you will see the tracers, the passive tracers like chlorophyll A over here and sea surface temperature. And in the satellite imagery, what you see here is mostly suspended sediments that is following this attracting LCS. At the same time, when you see the type 2, which is connected to the coastline at 2 points, you will see almost all the tracer that is there is kind of trapped in this enclosed region. So this is what we saw from the LCSs. Now, a question that can be asked immediately is...
Sorry, these field ridges are extracted from the lecture data?
No, this is from ISRO current.
From ISRO current?
Yes.
What is the resolution of the...
It's 0.25 degrees.
You're still able to resolve such fine features
Yes.
from that data? What is the integration time that you used to?
This was around 6 days or so.
Okay.
I have a question. So we have mathematical definition for this.
Yes, we have.
Can you just remind us?
I don't immediately have it me here.
How do you define something as an attracting point here in this particular case?
Sorry?
You said it's an attracting point, right?
Attracting line, I said. This whole white line is an attracting line.
Yeah, so how you say that based on the chlorophyll concentration and the sediment concentration?
No, the way we computed that line tells you that it will be an attracting line. So if you compute something known as the finite time Lyapunov exponent in backward time, then that the regions of that scalar field gives you the attracting lines. And the opposite happens in the case of forward integration. If you integrate it in forward in time, then you get repelling lines.
So
Okay.
fixed point here, what does it mean? The fixed point at the edge.
At the connection point there is, but we shouldn't think of it as a fixed point in the conventional sense, as in the point itself might move with time because of the finite time nature of the system.
So what do you mean by the point? What is a point? If you zoom into a single point, you're calling it, it's not fixed point, then what is it?
It shows saddle type behavior, but it's not a fixed point.
But I mean, I'm asking what is the meaning of a point in this context? Line I can understand if you.
Oh, the point I mean, if you look at the intersection of this white line with the coastline,
Yeah.
I'll point at this.
Yeah, but does it have any physical meaning?
It will be the saddle point of the flow. It will show saddle point kind of behavior.
Saddle point of the flow meaning?
So if I go back to here, so you will see if you have this LCS attached to the coastline at one point.
Yeah, so that's the point I'm not. So you say attached at one point. So what do you mean attached at one point? Okay.
It's kind of, you can think of the LCS to be a line and the coastline itself to be a line, and they are intersecting at one point. And this is the point of intersection. So the coastline is this black line, the red line is the LCS, and here is the intersection point, the red
Red
dot.
line is the LCS line.
LCS.
The point is it separates regions of that is in two different types of behavior.
That is one property, but the other property would be that since it's an attracting LCS, all the trajectories close to it in its neighborhood will tend to be coming towards it. That's what these black lines are showing.
Yes, so this is the velocity field at a time, and then you are finding the LCS at that time space. At a given time, you have a velocity field, and all of this corresponds to what's happening at that given time space. It's not evolving in time.
The system.
This is the reason why that point can move.
So what happens is when we compute the LCS, we need to integrate the velocity fields for a certain finite amount of time.
But you can do that with a fixed velocity field.
By fixed, you mean the
It's having an unsteady velocity. But FT tends to
Yeah.
there's some integration over time for the unsteadiness in the velocity. So the LCS needs information on the velocity field over.
Okay, maybe you could do it with this time space. Flow field be
Yes,
flow
but
field.
it should, in principle, it should not work because you're assuming it's steady and it's actually unsteady.
Okay. Then I have an issue with the point moving. The
Yeah,
point
the
moves
point
over a
also
larger
can-
time scale.
The point also can move.
yes, the point
point
can
can
move, and we'll see that later in the topic.
Okay. Yeah, key thing is that this line is an attractor.
Mhm.
And if you asymptotically extend that line, it intersects the shore at some point.
I'm not extending it manually. It appears to be intersecting the coastline through the computations. The results itself show that this line is intersecting the coastline, and we'll see actual results of that.
But how trustworthy are this ISRO current so close to the coast?
There are generally issues, and we actually have used high frequency radar currents uh, in the rest of the study. So this is the an evidence of these two types of coastally attached LCSs that we have seen. Okay, from the ISRO current. Now, a question that can be asked is, we almost always have these LCSs that we can see attached to the coast, but we always don't see such a good correspondence between the passive tracer fields and the LCSs, and why that is the case. So the case, why that is the case is because advection, because these structures are advective, they have influence on the advection only. Okay, but mixing also happens, and transport also happens because of diffusion, and then you have sources and sinks. So if you take that into account, generally what happens is, mostly in these settings, sources and sinks dominate. So for example, if you take sea surface temperature, the fluxes that we have at the interface of the atmosphere and the ocean is so high that advection generally hides behind it, and these impacts generally are not seen. But in case of sediments, the only source that we have for sediments in the coastal regions are the rivers, and in the open ocean we don't have any such sources. So that's why in the sediments, it's generally we can expect these correspondences to be seen. Also, we looked at the LCSs as advective barriers to advective transport. There are also other kinds of LCSs which are barriers to diffusive transport. Okay. Now, these are not barriers in the conventional sense, as in they don't stop diffusion from happening. What they tell you is that these structures tell you, the diffusion barriers tell you that locally extremal diffusion is happening. Either the diffusion is locally minimum or locally maximum. Okay. Now, we also see on the top panel the two kinds of diffusion barriers that we computed for the same setting. Okay. There we see the type 1 advective LCS and the diffusion barrier kind of show very similar structures. And same is the case for the repelling LCS and the the other kind of diffusion barrier and the type 2 LCS. And this is to be expected because the attracting LCSs will attract all the tracers near it, creating a very sharp gradient across it. And that sharp gradient will promote diffusion to happen. And that's why we get a diffusion maximizer over there and a diffusion minimizer over here. So now we have seen those results from the ISRO surface current, which is available at a resolution of 0.25 degrees, which will be around 25 kilometers for the Bay of Bengal. But the coastal processes are so much dynamic, it needs higher resolution data to actually correctly evaluate them. So what we did was, we used for the rest of the study what is known as high frequency radar surface currents. These are these stations which measure surface currents at a resolution of about 6 kilometers, 6 kilometer by 6 kilometer grids at an hourly temporal resolution along the coast of India. Okay, and that they give us an idea of the surface current and wave fields in the near shore regions up to an extent of about 200 kilometers from the coast. But challenge that we face with high frequency radar currents is we generally have a lot of gaps in the surface current fields because of a variety of reasons. And we needed to come up with a way to fill those gaps so as to be able to use them for the study. So what we have used is a method of from geostatistics called spatiotemporal kriging to fill those gaps. So what spatiotemporal kriging essentially does is, if you have a couple of sampled points and then you have an unsampled point where you want to estimate the data at the gap, you can estimate the gap as a linear combination of all the sampled points. And the coefficients of that linear combination can be inferred from the coherent structure of the data, of the observed data in both space and time. By that, I would mean something like this. So you see, this is what is known as a variogram. Okay, so we have the distance between the observed points, and then we have some on the y-axis something known as the semi-variance. Okay, if we can model that, we get a good idea of what the coefficients of that linear combination are, and then we are able to estimate the data at the unobserved point. So now this is what the high frequency radar data looks like. So we applied that as a proof of concept for our proposed method to the data from the Tamil Nadu coast. Okay, so here we have the Tamil Nadu high frequency radar station, and in the month of February, June, and November, we tried to fill it because we saw very varying kind of gaps in these 3 months. Okay, and this is what the spatial data density looks like. So towards the center of that domain, high frequency radar domain, we generally tend to have more data, and towards the periphery of the domain, the data density gets less and less. Also, if you see in the month of November, we had a period where the data was almost non-existent. There was no data for a couple of days, and that will become important for the talk. So we did the variogram modeling, and here in this case, the variogram is in both space and time. That's why you get a surface like that. And there was some modeling done on these variograms to get these results. So I'm showing you the results of the spatiotemporal kriging. So on the top row, you have the original surface currents with a lot of gaps that you can see. And these are the surface current fields that were filled using spatiotemporal kriging. This is for the month of February. Then we come into the month of June. We see here in this circle a partial presence of a sub-mesoscale eddy can be partially inferred from the gappy data that we see over there, and that circulation tends to be completely reconstructed using spatiotemporal kriging. The whole eddy is being reconstructed here. And
this is a sophisticated interpolation method, right?
it is, but it takes into account the statistics of the observed
But
data.
ultimately it's an interpolation.
It is an interpolation. Also, here what you see is for the month of November, I mentioned there was a period where no data was available. So here on the 6th and the 3rd we had data, and for 4th and 5th we did not have any data. But from the temporal covariance structure itself, the data was reconstructed, though this data has not been validated against any external source. Okay.
So have you tested this one? So you have data.
Mhm.
So in one of them you can remove data yourself.
Yes.
You tested it, right?
Yes, sir. I'm coming to that. That is the next slide, actually. So what happens is we don't have any other secondary source with such high resolution to actually validate the results of this filling. So what we did was we manually removed some data from the field and tried to fill that by using what is known as the leave-on out cross validation. So we picked one data, removed it, and then randomly from the field, and then tried to fill it. And these are the results of the cross validation. So you see here we had the original points that were removed, original data that was removed, and that is what is estimated by review. And this is what the statistics look like. So we generally have a correlation of more than 0.95 most of the times. And then the same method was extended to other coasts, other high frequency radar stations to check its generalizability. So this is for the coast, the Odisha coast high frequency radar station, and this is for Andhra Pradesh. And you can qualitatively from the results see how the reconstruction is.
So this method, what are the parameters which you have to kind of play around with before you say, oh, these values work very well for this data set?
So what you have to do is, once you compute what I call the variogram of the data, you need to fit a model to the variogram. And that model itself has certain parameters. So the better the fit there is between the variogram and this model, the better will be the reconstruction.
So see, I think you have, say, off the Chennai coast, four different kinds of it was. So, say near the coast, there was a recirculation region that you picked up right after you did. So, if you the data points that you are showing, they're all the same over time. Data points themselves are not.
No.
So, you could use that missing data that you had. You use that as a mask. What I mean is, you had a region where data was missing, where you picked up the recirculation. Use that as a mask. In a region where you have full data, and knock out the same region. You see, what you have done is you have randomly picked stuff. Can make sense?
Yes, I understand.
Whereas now, if you remove the same data, that then it sort of gives a little confidence, saying that yes, that recirculation zone actually. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, I understand that. And this was also.
You could use the missing data that you are doing as a mask to eliminate data at this point.
Actually, this was also pointed out to me by one of the reviewers of my work. And to answer that, what I would say is the results that I showed you is of what we call a 10% leave-on out cross validation. So at once, we randomly selected 10% of the points. Now, and we iterated it over a large number of times, almost 100 times, expecting that these iterations will create configurations of all sorts of gaps. So that was the expectation.
I think there's a question from one of the online participants. Can I just check?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, Aniket, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had one question. So you said high frequency data. What is the frequency required to basically be able to capture these features that you're looking for? So is there a minimum frequency?
So the higher the frequency, the more smaller processes you will be able to capture. But the kind of processes that we are interested in, hourly data works quite well.
Hourly data, okay. And then following question. So in some sense with the kriging, you're doing something like a missing point estimation, right?
Yes.
So you're trying to estimate what is missing and reconstruct the flow field. Is my understanding correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
I have a question. What is the minimum density you need to get together, the 10%? Is there a scaling for the density of points needed for this method to work?
The minimum number of points you mean?
It's like a density, like what do you think will be makes sense? So I would expect a density as a criteria. Let's say if you remove 10% points, this is what you get. If you remove 50% of the points, you can still reconstruct.
Yeah, you can reconstruct, but the quality of reconstruction will go down with larger gaps.
And is there an understanding how does it go down?
No.
Not one.
So the statistics that you see here become a little poorer when the same thing was tried on 50% of the data. So we also cross-validated by removing 50% of the data.
So this is 10% error. How much is the error?
The RMSE is about 0.04.
0.004.
0.04.
0.0.
So you see, we have the cross-validation results for 50% of the data, and this is what the correlations look like: 0.96 and 0.96. We also went ahead and removed one full day out of the data, and this is what the results show. The RMSEs went up all the way from 0.04 to 0.13. Shall I proceed?
Yeah, please.
So then we come back to the coastally attached Lagrangian coherent structures again. Okay. So this is what you see. This is a FTLE field that was computed using the field high frequency radar currents, the ones that we reconstructed. And this is a backward computation. So the backward FTLE, the ridges on that field will give you the attracting Lagrangian coherent structures. So this very dark line that you see is an attracting Lagrangian coherent structure. And then we simulated the trajectories of a grid of Lagrangian particles in the vicinity of that structure. And this is what, as expected, it looks like.
And what is the integration time you have used to compute the FTE field here?
This is for 6 days.
Again, 6 days?
Yes, yes.
But with hourly data.
With hourly.
The satellite current was everyday data.
Yes. And so we see these particles, this grid of particles, most of them are tending to be attracted towards that FTLA ridge or the attracting LCS.
So these are passive tracers computed using surface current.
Yes.
So if we computed the FTE using the satellite data, what did you see?
For this same, I am not sure what I'm going to see.
Okay.
Now, from this simulation itself, we can get a fair idea of what would happen to river plumes, because this is the Andhra Pradesh high frequency radar domain, and the Krishna and Godavari rivers drain in over there. So if you see, these two rivers that are draining in are parts of the Godavari system, and this is the Krishna system. So if they drain in very close to the attracting LCS, and this tracer blob that you see here is intended to mimic a river plume. So this is a bivariate Gaussian distribution that we created just near the river mouth, and you will see what happens to it. Almost all of the particles will be aligned with the attracting LCS over here. Now these are purely advective simulations, and we also did some simulations with where diffusion was included. So here we have the diffusion. This is not stopping. So here we also included the effects of diffusion. Now, because of the stretching of the blob, the interfacial area increases, and that gives way to more and more diffusion.
Sorry, how do you include diffusion? The passive tracer.
This is a random form.
Yes, with a random time.
Your attraction, strength of attraction is more on the left hand side of the attractor than it is. Both from here, look at this, there, we go there, few outliers, but there are particles to the right of your barrier which are not. If I look at the one on the left, you started off the rectangle, quite a few of them. On the right hand side, it doesn't seem flow towards your attractor is not as strong as the flow towards the attractor on the left.
So the attracting nature will be in the local neighborhood of the LCS. So particles which are fairly far away from the LCS may not be attracted towards it.
No, that I understand. Okay, then I rephrase it. So that region of attraction is larger on the left hand side than it is on the right.
Maybe to begin with, the system was already asymmetric.
Because you
I don't
have to
know.
look at the middle path. Okay.
Already asymmetric.
It was already asymmetric to begin with.
Already asymmetric. Just let it go. Just let the asymmetry.
Actually,
But I think that's going to be strong.
Yeah, it does seem to be stronger than that. That's what I thought. Because even here, even in the middle path, there's nothing on the left. You know what I'm saying? There are still, even though there are few, there's still it's fine. Even the diffusion, everything is biased towards the right. That's the point of it.
Rahul, if you don't mind, I think there's a question online. Can you just ask?
Do you have a question?
Yeah, so I had a question about the spatio-temporal kriging. So you have shown that statistically you get results that are in agreement, right? But is there any guarantee that the physics is enforced? Like, are you enforcing conservation laws that, Navier-Stokes and other things obey in this method, or is it just statistically?
It's just statistically based.
Okay, thank you.
Now, since the covariance structures that we compute comes from the observed data itself, most of the physics I expect is embedded in it, though not all of it.
I see. Okay, thank you.
So, shall I proceed?
Yep, thank you.
So we saw what happens to these discrete trajectories in the presence of Lagrangian coherent structures. Here we try to see what would an entire field of passive tracer behave in the presence of these coastally attached Lagrangian coherent structures. So on the left, what you will see is a field of sea surface temperature. Okay, that will evolve only under the effects of advection in the presence of this type 1 kind of structure. A very sharp gradient is being created along that LCS. So here on the figure on the right, the top panel shows you the sea surface temperature evolution in the presence of the coastally attached Lagrangian coherent structure and its gradient field. So we tend to get a very high gradient aligned with the LCS, and the direction of the gradient is almost perpendicular to the LCS.
What was the initial condition here for SST?
We took the first day of SST data
From satellite.
from satellite. This is from GHR SST, the global high resolution.
So, and then you adapted the SST like a tracer.
Mhm.
You look at the satellite data from this day after advection. How do they compare?
They don't compare well. Again,
It is not a passive tracer. The temperature is not a passive tracer.
our understanding is it's because of the sources that the resemblance is not good.
No, the temperature is not a passive tracer.
Pa-
This equation is
Yes, yes.
part of the evolution.
Yes.
I mean, there are a couple of ways you can interpret this. One is that there is this coherent structure which is causing it to go into this configuration, or there are frontal dynamics associated, right? Straining of like the mesoscale in any field. That itself will cause it to cause the configuration to change. So I don't think it is simply affected as a passive tracer in this case, the temperature field.
Also, in the speaking in cooling from
That's why you say it's not a passive.
It's not a passive tracer.
But in a satellite, will not even see some of the scales that are getting created.
No.
Right?
And the other thing is, as I've mentioned, the sources tend to weigh very heavily on this. So we also have a paper that explored what terms modulate the sea surface temperature the most. And it turns out most of the times the heat fluxes at the interface has almost 60% influence on the temperature, and then comes advection, which is around 16 to 20%.
But if you ask the same question on SST gradients, the answer will be different.
On SST gradients, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
So you're saying the influence of heat fluxes is 60% in setting the SST. If you ask what sets the SST gradients, then it will be a different answer.
Then it will be a different answer. Yes. Assuming the fluxes are not changing over very long regions, over very large regions.
Fluxes may not have very small scale gradients. Please proceed.
But then clouds generally tend to create those small differences in fluxes. Yeah, so that's the sea surface temperature, and here in the bottom we see the sea surface salinity also doing the same. Then we come to the second type of LCSs that we thought would exist, and this is what it looks like. So if you kind of extend the imagination, you'll see this dark contour, the ridge connected to the coastline at 2 points. Now, as I mentioned, it might appear to form a heteroclinic connection, but it is not, because heteroclinic connections form under certain very special cases, and this is not one of them. So what happens is these two LCSs might come arbitrarily close to each other but will not connect, and hence the flux across this will be generally finite and not non-existent. You will see there is a gap. Now what this forms, what this does is it forms an enclosed region, enclosed between the LCS and the coastline. So we get a region that is being enclosed here. Now since this LCS is an advective barrier, no advective flux will be going through this, and whatever material that is there in this enclosed region will tend to be trapped as long as this structure exists, and that is what we will see. All the red particles are kind of trapped near the coast, while the blue particles flow down the coast. So this again will have implications on river influx. So imagine these rivers draining off a lot of fresh water, sediment-rich, nutrient-rich water, and if this kind of a structure is present during that time, that water will be trapped in the coastal region itself, and will not mix with the open ocean.
Then affect the interannual variability of surface currents and surface tracer distributions.
Interannual?
Yeah, because annually the eddy fields will change a little bit, and depending on whether it coincides with this LCS structure, it could affect how much the river flow and makes away from the coast compared to strand.
So again, it's the same simulation, different snapshots of it, and these two figures actually show you the particle densities. So just to show that almost all the red particles are being trapped inside, and all the blue are outside, they don't come in the enclosed region.
At the coast, you have an absorbing boundary condition, the particles are being absorbed.
So in the
coast there, your tracer particles in the equal coast, what happens? They get absorbed.
it might appear here to be observed because I overlaid this map on it, and the grids exactly do not align.
Okay.
So
But they're accumulating. The density is increasing like that second row, third map. That's what I think. Somewhere it's becoming much more tough.
yes. So that is that. So then we thought, is this an isolated case of coastally attached LCS, or
One question. You said you did diffusion using random walks. What is the equivalent horizontal diffusivity?
about 10 to the power 2 or 3, if I remember. We computed that using Smagorinsky parameterization. So that comes out to be around 10 to the power 2. So then we thought, are these isolated cases of coastally attached LCSs, or do they appear very often? And this is some examples that we were able to find in the satellite imagery. You see, the top row shows you the type 1 kind of LCS behavior, and here in the bottom row we have the type 2 kind of LCS behavior. And as I said, in the enclosed region, because none of the material is leaving, everything will tend to recirculate over there, and the signatures of that recirculation kind of can be inferred from the satellite imagery from the sediment, uh, suspended sediments. You see, it's like kind of. So I'll. So what we did, what we found out from this study was that indeed coastally attached Lagrangian coherent structures are there. There are two types of them, simple configurations, type 1 and type 2. Type 1, what it does is it tends to enhance the mixing between coastal and open ocean waters, while as the type 2 tends to inhibit that mixing. And this was a collaborative work. So Dr. Sarov my PhD supervisor, and then I had two colleagues working on it. Hitesh Gupta, who is currently at NCMR Deogharia. Prasenjit Dev, pursuing his PhD from IIT Bombay, he was doing his master's there. And then we have Professor Abhijit Gangapaitai from UMass, Katmat. Dr. Rajesh Sikhapuri, who provided us kindly with the ISRO current data. And Dr. BK Jena from NIOT, who provided us with the high frequency data.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll take questions from the online participants first. See, online participants, are there any questions?
None from my end.
Thanks, Aniket. I think someone just messaged. Can you unmute and ask the question? Who messaged?
Yes, Rahul, thank you for your talk. This is Devashish Sengupta.
Hello, sir.
So, I wanted to ask, you have done a basic validation against geostrophic currents from Aviso, for example, at these three locations?
Are you asking me that whether we have done some validation against geostropic currents?
Yes, yes.
Of what? Of the ISRO currents or of the high frequency radar?
Of the radar data.
No, we have not done that.
For
And generally,
example,
we
for
did that.
example, can you reproduce the seasonal cycle of currents along the east coast of India? If you take an average over your domain, where you think the radar data is most reliable, and compare it with geostrophic currents, I think over a 1 degree by 1 degree box within the domain, it should give a reasonable match. Or has anybody else done it?
Some of my colleagues actually did that, and
And
what they found was generally there is not a good match, and
I
we
see.
think that discrepancy actually comes in because of the scales that these two data sets resolve.
Mm-hmm.
So the geostropic current will generally be these large scale features, whereas high frequency radar mostly mesoscale, sub-mesoscale kind of processes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Devashish or any others online? Vijay?
Rahul, you can show us your references, please. That slide is on the right, but we didn't see it. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
So I have a couple of questions. Are there questions from others? Into water. So I think this coastally attached LCS in flow past bluff bodies, flow separation has been studied a lot using the LCS well. I think what you're talking about is attachment and separation and reattachment points. So I wonder if you look at the literature there, because first, even before these applications, the LCS was used to understand flow separation. And there they talk in terms of not the instantaneous zero shear points, but time average zero shear points are what are relevant for detecting where this LCS attaches to the coastline. So I'm just saying that literature may be quite helpful in interpreting come off what you're saying. But my follow-on question is, these FTLEs also have an instantaneous limit. Because, like you said, what can you figure out by just assuming the flow is steady? Or another way of asking the same question is, if you make the integration time 0, you still get these eigenvalues of the strain rate tensors. So what can you learn from those? And why is it important that you have to do 6-day integration computation? Is there enough information available just based on the instantaneous data?
That was actually a suggestion that we got from a lot of places. When the inherent scale of the flow is not known, it's generally wise to use these instantaneous structures and then maybe see how the process works. We did not give it a consideration at that time. It could be something actually.
For example, a simple result in flow path of bodies or aerodynamics is that if you look at the point of 0 shear, which is where this NCS will have to attach or separate. The separation or reattachment. You could just check if where the point of 0 shear is compared to what you are detecting as points where the NCS are connected. Just to establish the case that instantaneous data is not enough and you have to necessarily do this computation.
Even along the same thing, if you go to three-dimensional flow, what they call open separation, you get this type 1 kind of, you can be surface streamlines. The typical visualization they do with surface streamlines. Type 1 separation is basically flow comes and you get a separation. If you look at the surface streamlines corresponding to that, that will be an attractor. The same one. What he is talking about, your type 2. You can get type 1 also.
Because there is convergence happening over there? Or?
Yeah, so there is, again, you don't have a bubble. Once in 2 dimensions, you don't have a bubble, it doesn't reattach. So that's what you're calling type. The other thing is if you go to 3D flow and there is separation, then you can have that bubble type separation or you can have an open separation where you have a separation surface going off. If you look at the surface scheme, you will see that it is exactly what you're talking about. It's an attractor. You have velocity vectors pointed towards this thing. Quite a bit of work done that also.
Second question I have is, there is some paper like this from 2007 or 8, I don't remember, by Lagrangian who have done similar kind of analysis of Monterey.
Yes, Shaden and
I don't remember the other name. So how is there? What is different from the kind of analysis they have done?
So in their analysis, they have also seen a type 2 kind of a structure. So they also saw a structure which resembled kind of the type 2 structure. What's different is they just saw the structure and then they tried to compare that against drifter trajectories and things. Here, these two configurations that we thought will exist kind of gives you a complete picture of what coherent Lagrangian coherent structures look like near the coast, and there might be even more complex configurations, but they will be always composed of these two kind of fundamental building blocks. You can arrange them in different ways to get a way more complex coastally attached Lagrangian coherent structures. So that was the idea, to separate them into two very distinct fundamental configurations. But yes, similar observations also have been made by Shaden and others.
Any other questions?
I have a question, Mani.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a sort of general question for you. Has anyone tried to estimate these radar derived currents to actually estimate diffusivity, lateral diffusivity in your? You had a quantity called D in one of your equations. Can that be estimated from the radar currents?
Yes. So using the
Can
same
you-
method that we used
Can
to.
you go to that equation of yours? Yes, this one. So you have this high resolution currents in an hourly interval. Is it possible to estimate that quantity that you have called diffusion?
The diffusivity, yeah, it is. So we can use the same method, the
Mhm.
parameter that we use to compute the diffusivity in the case of the ISRO current, which is
Mhm.
the Smagorinsky parameterization. We can
Mhm.
apply the same to the high frequency radar currents to get the diffusivity.
I see. Okay.
But
Okay.
what we will get will effectively be the eddy diffusivities, and since the Smagorinsky parameterization depends on the grid size, since the grid size of high frequency radar will be smaller, the diffusivities will tend to be smaller.
Yes, that is correct. Very interesting. Lots to talk about when we meet. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
But just on the same question,
Mhm.
if you want to estimate diffusivity in diffusion term, you need to estimate the other terms. No, only that it says this balance has to work out. So this is my estimate of the diffusion term. You don't know anything about S.
No, we don't know. And all the simulations that we have seen, we are actually not considering that at all. So what we are assuming that we are given an initial distribution and then it evolves under the effects of advection or diffusion.
So that's another way of saying you assume S and that decay terms are
No.
zero,
Yes.
and then you will estimate what would be the diffusion.
Yes.
What is the physical mechanism for the decay term? What is that gamma?
So you can think, for example, sediments. These are surface sediments, right? So because they are heavy particles, they will tend to settle down to the bottom. So that will be a process of decay. That surface is losing sediment particles. Or in the case of, say, chlorophyll, if the phytoplanktons are being consumed by higher animals in the food chain higher up, then that might decrease.
So you're looking, so more fine grained, so you're looking at it as diffusion as opposed to a source term. Because you're saying a source term would be a larger
Scale.
larger length scale than this. Is that what you're saying?
Not always, because say in the case of sediments, the sources are the river mouths, which given this the size of the domain is very small.
So in the equation, I would look at that more as a boundary condition.
Mhm.
So you're not simulating the river mouth would be a boundary condition.
He's saying even the sediments that get into the ocean.
Will settle, because that I understand. Will settle. You are choosing to simulate, you are choosing to call it a decay term. I'm saying you could well call it a distributed source term. And I'm just curious as to why you pick one over the other. Does that have to do with the length scale?
Generally, this is
Or it's usually treated as a
it is
decay
generally
term?
separated out from the sources and sinks, because you might have say reactive species, okay, and they have a certain lifetime. So that decay will tend to capture the half life or.
Because why should that settling be proportional to P itself? That is the main difference between source and decay is that decay is proportional to feed. Source probably doesn't. So why should settling be like a decay and not like a source? Not like a sink. I understand
now
settling will make the concentration go down, but I understand.
I understand, yeah.
But it would be a constant rate.
Mhm.
What?
Actually, I was incorrect to say that settling will resemble decay here. Rather, it will be kind of sink.
Because the sediments are sinking. Okay, cool. Yeah, again, apologies for the delay in the start of the seminar. I got stuck outside.
It's okay, sir.
Any other questions?
Like, you talked about the type 2 LCs, right?
Mhm.
What category do you classify it? So it's a attracting.
So, whenever you have attracting or repelling, you always say that with respect to the behavior near the saddle point. So if
So there is
the
a saddle point.
so,
Type 2 for the type 2.
so the type 2, since it is connected to the coastline at 2 points, there are 2 saddle points. So the behavior will be one with respect to the first saddle point and will be opposite in the with respect to the other saddle point. So you'll see the arrow kind of comes out from this point and goes towards this point. So with respect to this point, this will behave like an attracting LCS, whereas with respect to this point, that will behave like a repelling LCS. And that's why you will see I've called this attracting and repelling, and here I did not mention that at all. I just called them LCS.
Let's thank Rahul once more.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you, Deogharia, listener, and again for joining online.
Thanks, Mani. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for the interesting